It was before dawn when the ducal corridors learned the sound of a woman who would not be still. A single, urgent cry split the cold air. Tapestries shivered with the echo. Servants who had kept their lamps low and their faces neutral stopped within doorways, as runners in muffled shoes carried messages that would not wait for morning. Outside, bells for the Feast of the Purification had long been extinguished. Inside, a bedchamber was being arranged like a courtroom, its velvet canopy pulled taut, its candles set as witnesses in silver holders. The house held its breath, because in that house proof would soon be made of what law and lineage insisted upon: consummation, witnessed and sealed, the hinge on which dynasties turned. If you find these uncoveries compelling, please like and subscribe to follow further investigations like this, and leave a comment naming a historical figure you'd like us to examine next. Your suggestion may shape the next revelation. Stay with the narrative to the end for a reading of the archival notes that keep this episode from being mere rumor. Records indicate the date with judicial calm. Early February 1502, the days aligned with the Feast of the Purification. The chronicle entries, marginal ink neat and unyielding, refer to the night of the benediction and to the signatures of the chancellors. The locality is Ferrara and its rival courts, where cloth and arms, prayers and ledgers were equal instruments of rule. To the outsider, dynastic marriages were a matter of tapestries and dowries. To those who had read the chancery rolls, they were treaties enacted upon flesh and witnessed by ink. The bride in these records appears as a series of concise facts: 22 years old, twice married before, twice returned in disgrace or grief. Her name, given, then obfuscated in some public chronologies, appears fully in the private ledgers, a woman whose past had been read in the gossip of markets and the thin columns of pamphlets, yet who would convert that past into an instrument. She had learned the circuits of court by necessity. 2 failed marriages meant public suspicion and private calculation. The first was brief, the second longer, but ended beneath accusations that never reached the level of formal prosecution. Injuries, miscarriages, a household that turned on her when the heir did not come. Those experiences hollowed her reputation of any naivete, but they filled her with a pragmatic intelligence that ran along the seam of survival and ambition. She could be pious where piety cleared a passage, demure where demureness opened doors, and unsparing where strategy required decisive hand. Against the soft expectation that she would be a pawn, she cultivated, quietly, in the margins of her hours, a voice that read contracts, petitions, and the lawyer's small print with a kind of intimate relish. The groom, an heir in his mid-20s, was not chosen solely for lineage. Martial in bearing and trained in the rudiments of engineering, he had spent years acquiring the look of a man who could repair ramparts and command men. His features were chiseled by campaigns and drill. His hands were calloused in a way that testified to a life of practice more than luxury. To his father and to the chancellors, he represented vigor and the promise of continuity. To the court, he represented the visible instrument through which legitimacy would manifest. Yet even he stood before the bed as a component of a procedure rather than as an ideal of romance. His role required proof not only of marriage but of virility, and that proof was to be granted or refused before men accustomed to reading ink more readily than flesh. The Duke's council had seen such matters before. Precedent sat on its shelves like sleeping dogs. What was peculiar in this case was the insistence on documentation, multiple consummations, not whispered and hushed, but recorded with signatures, marginal notes, and the placement of witnesses. It was not merely that a marriage must be consummated, it was that consummation must be converted into documentary proof, an alchemy performed by chancellors, not by priests alone. The chancery rolls preserved the mechanism. Entries in a firm, practiced hand, witnessed by Master Lorenzo, Chancellor, affirmed by Notary Giacomo, turn a private act into a political shield. The records, when read together, suggest a protocol. The bed became a tribunal. The mattress, if one reads with a dry eye, was a dais. The lead-up to that night carried its own choreography. Processions had passed through Ferrara with the slow grandeur of civic theater, banners with embroidered griffins, trumpets muted by velvet gloves, and the clergy with their candles. The choice of the Feast of the Purification was deliberate. Catholics understood purification as a social and liturgical act that consecrated birth and marriage to public memory. To align a wedding consummation with a feast day was to cloak political necessity in religious ceremony, an argument that made dissent both impious and treasonous. The protagonist arranged her meters of cloth and ribbon with an eye to these associations. She allowed the veil to become part of her performance, not a symbol of subservience, but a device to direct attention. Her rivals watched. Chief among them was a duchess whose power had lain coiled for years like a cat beside a hearth. A court matron with broad networks, she had assumed influence as naturally as others breathed. Her husband, older, established, had built alliances across provinces. She guarded those alliances the way a matron guards her seat at the high table. The arrival of a new bride presented a threat. A woman with the cunning to remake misfortune into authority could unsettle the established balance. Where the matron saw propriety and the preservation of honor, the younger woman saw openings. Their rivalry would not announce itself in public declarations. It would unfold in whispered consultations, in the placement of cups at receptions, and in the careful selection of which nobles would be invited to which chamber. On the night appointed, the bedchamber had the hush of a chapel and the vigilance of a courtroom. Servants arranged the linens, smoothing velvet so that no crease would betray a secret. Behind tapestries, chancellors in plain garments took their places, their seals and inkwells ready like instruments of some secular sacrament. Witnesses included not only clerical men, but men of law and notaries, whose marks upon parchment would later fasten the night's events to public fate. Witnesses kept to the shadows. Their faces were lit by candlelight that threw lines and made older men look younger men more severe. One of them, a Sicilian notary whose hand is later quoted in 3 different ducal registers, left a marginal note, "Done as is customary, with witnesses present and the seal affixed." The language is measured, the implication is not. The ritual itself resists prurient description because archival silence covers the intimate as surely as a veil. Contemporary accounts avoid lurid detail. Their purpose is the conversion of an act into evidence. The dramatized memory of the evening places emphasis on texture over motion, the rustle of velvet as garments were arranged, the metallic scent of wax and tallow, the whisper of linen shifting. Candles guttered and were relit. Strains of chant from the chapel below were folded into the room like a low ecclesiastical tide. The bride, whose hands had learned not to tremble in the face of public ruin, approached the bed as one approaches a tribunal, resolute, practiced, inwardly cataloging possibilities. The groom, trained to be the outward demonstration of vigor, performed the role expected of him, precise as a soldier completing a drill. Witnesses wrote, not in the spirit of voyeurism, but in the spirit of jurisprudence. The chancellors recorded what they were placed to witness, the arrival and signing of the parties, the presence of the proper witnesses, and the subsequent entries that certified consummation. Multiple notations over the course of several nights, first night confirmed, second night contrary to rumor, appear in the private ledger. These repeated entries served to preempt rumor. By producing not one but several attestations, the family constructed a lattice of evidence robust enough to withstand gossip and political attack. The bed, then, had become a stage where private consent and public oath intersected under the authoritative hands of men whose business was to transform deeds into text. In a rare direct line to a servant's memorandum, there is an observation of the bride's face, calm as marble, and of the chancellor's silence, heads bent as if in prayer, phrases that suggest not only ritual but calculation. Archives suggest the bride understood both the necessity and the cost. She had endured the humiliation of whispered accusations and the deprivation of status. This night offered her a chance to invert that narrative. To be witnessed, in her judgment, was to be made untouchable. If the ritual served as a shield, the shield's edge was sharpened in the weeks and months that followed. The legal validation accomplished its immediate aim. The ducal harbingers used the documented consummation to announce continuity where rumor had suggested fracture. However, the political weather did not clear. Within the year, the records that had granted legitimacy would be called upon again, not to prove an heir's paternity, but to console a court after sorrow. The birth chamber opened in summer of 1502, not as triumph, but as catastrophe. The records document a delivery that ended in stillbirth and a mother whose life hung at the narrow edge of survival. Chroniclers, who preferred neat moral arcs, recorded the event with restrained language. Childborn, but not to remain. The mother was grievously ill and in danger. The marginalia of the notary who had witnessed the consummations is terse. Medical attendants called. Fever ensued. The immediate human consequence was brutal and private. There are letters, some preserved, some lost, that trace the sisterly and familial consolation. The bride's body, rendered by history into an instrument, had been used again and again. Now it failed in the most intimate measure. She survived the fever that took many in such circumstances, and the survival itself was later read as a kind of political resilience. The stillbirth became a hinge for rumor and a lever for those who wished to unsettle the ducal house. It also, paradoxically, intensified the bride's political utility. A childless marriage could still be fortified by alliances, and a woman who had endured death and returned to court in the wake of grief commanded a peculiar authority. It was in the shadow of that grief that the affair began, an affair inscribed not in romantic flourishes but in records of meetings, letters whose margins carry phrases of strategic consolation, and the quiet recalibration of alliances. Her liaison was with a powerful nobleman already married to a woman of influence, the very court matron who had been her rival. That the nobleman was married added a layer of danger and leverage. Archives suggest the affair began as confidences, counsel on political maneuvers, the sharing of knowledge about the distribution of patrons, visits that doubled as political conferences. The liaison, when it became known, was not merely a scandal of the flesh, but an upending of networks. It created new bonds and new threats. The rival matron, who had once guarded the corridors of influence with an iron smile, found her position compromised by rumors that undermined both social standing and the trust of key allies. Politics in Renaissance courts functioned in webs. An affair tugged as many strands as it could. Men allied with the matron learned of the liaison through leaked notes, through servants who traversed households, and through keen eyes at receptions. Letters show attempts to mediate the damage. One reads like a negotiation. Remove this cloud from the house, and allies shall remain steadfast. But the bride, now a strategist honed by hard experience, did not retreat. Rather, she parlayed the intimacy into a form of insurance. The nobleman she befriended provided not only emotional remittance but political cover. Networks that could be activated to ward off challenges, voices that could speak in chancery in her favor if needed. Her choice was neither moral heroism nor simple vice. It was instrument and origin of new power. The court's response was predictable and braided. Letters of complaint circulated. The matron amplified her indignation through alliances, and factions formed in small rooms where the clinking of glass mattered more than words. Yet the legal armor of those initial documented consummations continued to function. When whispers aimed to delegitimize the marriage or to install rival claimants, the chancery's papers, those inked attestations, were produced like shields. The ritual documentation had been designed to withstand not only ordinary slander, but systematic political attacks. It was a preemptive legal strategy whose success became clear as petitions and proclamations referenced not rumor, but record. Beyond immediate reaction, there was a quieter, longer spread. Other courts of northern Italy watched and learned. Records from neighboring duchies in the following decades show the adoption of similar practices. Witnesses summoned to bedchambers, notations made by chancellors, seals affixed to attestations of consummation. Where once marriage frustration might be a matter for scandal, it became, in some courts, a bureaucratic affair that could be mediated by documents. The bed, as tribunal, moved from being an oddity to a precedent. Still, precedent is not destiny. The woman at the center of these events, once stigmatized, twice married, and twice tested, emerged not merely as a beneficiary of law, but as a maker of force. Her reputation shifted in ways that surprised her contemporaries. Those who had once called her reputation into question now approached with petitions and respect. The chancellors, who had been instruments, came to regard her as a figure whose favor was worth currying. The matron rival found her influence curtailed in arenas where personal proximity mattered most. The nobleman who had lent his networks found himself with new obligations that complicated his household's peace. Among the surviving letters, there is one of particular note. Written on heavy paper, edged with the watermark of an Italian mill, it is addressed to a provincial lord and signed in a hand that is both determined and weary. It reads, in part, "What we make public by ink we defend by law. What we preserve by seal we render difficult to unmake." The author, widely accepted by scholars to be the Duchess herself, was making, in a few sparse sentences, the argument that would underpin the protocol's legacy. The personal had been converted into a public mechanism. The woman had learned to use the tools available to her: ink, seal, witnesses, alliances. Yet not all consequences were triumph. The affair and the loss reshaped her interior life. In the small hours when candlelight slid across the tapestries, she kept a private ledger of debts owed and favors promised. She learned the price of becoming untouchable, moments of solitude where grief arose, and where the cost of strategy was measured in human currency. The archive preserves a fragment of a poem she may have composed or been cited as composing. Lines that speak of the veil that hides and the seal that binds suggest an awareness that the instruments of power could not completely shelter the soul's wounds. By the time the protocol began to be imitated elsewhere, the Duchess had settled into a role that married agency with caution. Her adversary, the matron, maintained a presence at court, but with diminished autonomy. Her husband continued to negotiate alliances, now wary of the new currents. The nobleman, a figure whose marriage had been complicated by duty and desire, continued to be both asset and liability. The court itself changed subtly. Where once the private remained private by custom, afterwards private acts were more frequently transformed into public artifacts designed to stabilize succession and to inoculate houses against rumor. The archival record leaves the final verdict of moral judgment unspoken. The chancellery did its work. The records spoke with a voice that was neither compassionate nor cruel, only procedural. The woman at the center of this drama, wounded, cunning, resilient, became, through action and survival, an actor who altered the grammar of lineage. She weaponized visibility and protected herself with the apparatus of law. Her story forced other courts to reckon with the idea that intimacy might be converted into legitimacy, and that women, through means available even in constrained systems, might exert remarkable agency. When historians later gathered the strands, ledgers, marginal notes, letters, memoranda, they debated motives and outcomes, and the ethics of a woman who chose to turn her life into public proof. Some read her as opportunist, others as survivor. What cannot be doubted is that the events of early 1502 produced a ripple that reached beyond one ducal bed to touch the practice of courts across northern Italy. The bed had become a courtroom. The courtroom had become precedent. The woman who had once been watched as if by default become a watcher of her own fate. There remain other pages to turn. The affair's full ramifications for neighboring houses, the matron's countermoves in subsequent years, and the precise legal transformations adopted elsewhere persist in the archives as threads waiting to be drawn. In the next ledger entry, a marginalia discovered behind a binding in a provincial collection, a note hints at correspondence between two chancellors that may reveal how the practice was exported. Those documents will be examined and narrated with the same attention given here, to texture, to evidence, and to the human decisions that transformed private calamity into a framework for power. For now, the story of that night in February and the months that followed remains a study in how a woman wrested authority from the instruments she was offered. Her life, inscribed by ink and sealed by witnesses, stands as both caution and inspiration. Caution because the mechanisms of power demand payment. Inspiration because even within rigid systems, strategic intelligence can carve channels of influence. The Duchess's 3 marriages in one night were less an act of spectacle than a deliberate craft, an enactment of legitimacy, a conversion of rumor into record, and, ultimately, a transformation of the political landscape. Those letters, when unfolded, show how the protocol traveled, first as counsel between 2 wary chancellors, then as copy and variant, then as decree adapted to local custom. Some houses took only the formality, the layered witnesses and sealed transcripts, leaving affection untouched. Others embraced the full conversion of intimacy into instrument. The matron answered not with spectacle but with craft, a careful stringing of alliances, a public observance of piety, and measures that made her household less vulnerable to the same proofs. Over decades, the practice hardened into habit in some courts and was rejected as scandal in others. Chroniclers recorded ceremonies with the same neutrality as they recorded harvests. Poets murmured of veils and ledgers. In the end, the Duchess's ledger lay folded in a provincial binding, its edges worn by hands that could neither wholly praise nor fully condemn. The law had been altered, the heart had been priced, and history continued to argue with itself before those pages.